I need to hold this microphone like this. Okay. First of all, I'd like to say a very big thank you to the organisers of the forum. It's been a wonderful couple of days already, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present my work. Just going to sort out some tech thing. Okay, brilliant. Okay, there we go. So I wanted to start by I actually wanted to start by timing myself so I know how long I have. So bear with me. Okay. Yeah. I want to think about what we mean by nomadic heritage. Because I think in one broad sense, it can mean heritage produced by nomadic civilizations. So it might mean music, food, sports, and indeed yesterday when we traveled to the International Nomad Festival, we were treated to many of these forms of heritage. But it is notable that while we were enjoying these forms of heritage, we were not ourselves moving. Well, we were moving very slightly, we were walking around the good, but we weren't ourselves engaging in nomadism or mobile pastoralism. So my point is that these forms of heritage that we were enjoying, whatever their connection to nomadism, we can imagine them as being practiced without any actually existing nomadism or mobile pastoralism. But I think there's another way in which nomadism or mobile pastoralism gets thought of in terms of heritage, and that is as a mode of animal husbandry or land use itself. So the pastoralism itself is thought of as heritage, not just the cultural forms that are kind of superstructural on this economic base, as it were. So I think this is a kind of emerging form of heritage. It's something that we're seeing more and more of in international fora. So on the left here, I have put up the listing of transhumance. Now, of course, we can quibble about the relationship between transhumance and nomadism and so on and so forth, but my point here is that a form of mobility with livestock is itself being recognized as heritage. So this is, in 2022, 10 European countries submitting an application for transhumance, the seasonal droving of livestock, to UNESCO, and in December 2023, this was indeed ratified as intangible cultural heritage. Also interesting, I think, is another emergent use of heritage in the form of globally important agricultural heritage systems, or GIAHS. Now, this is a concept promoted by the FAO. And in a sense, agricultural heritage systems in our context might seem a slightly unfortunate name in that it seems to perhaps exclude pastoralism. But in fact, we can see how this concept has been applied to certain forms of extensive animal husbandry. So I give one example here of somewhere in Thailand, where the wetland buffalo pastoral agro-ecosystem has been listed as globally important agricultural heritage. And the listing mentions the importance of the mobility of the buffalo in constituting this particular heritage system. Now, I'm going to talk more about this form of heritage towards the end of my presentation. But just to give you another example of one of the ways in which mobile pastoralism has been thought of in terms of heritage, I refer you to an article by an anthropologist, Zoe Cormack, who discusses the way in which ideas of heritage have been used in northern Kenya to defend pastoralism in the context of the Kenyan state's infrastructural ambitions in this area. So a customary institution known as the Deva for the management of grazing on communal lands has been promoted as a form of heritage. So I think we can see already various ways in which the practices and institutions of involved in the management of mobile livestock have been recently thought of, reconceptualized in terms of heritage. Okay. So I want to turn now to my own ethnographic work on which discusses several things, but one of its themes is the relationship between mobile pastoralist land use and ideas of heritage. So my book, China's Camel Country, Livestock and Nation Building at a Pastoral Frontier, is almost out now. In fact, it will be published tomorrow, I think. And this is based on field work that I conducted in the west of China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, in Alsha League, Alsha between 2012 and 2019. So in this book, let's not go there yet. Let's keep looking at my the cover of my book. No, I can't do the mouse, sorry. Let's look at this slide now. In this book, I explore how ideas of heritage were used to defend pastoralism by local Mongols in the context of the Chinese state's environmental and developmental policies targeting pastoralists. And what I argue and what I want to talk about in this presentation is that this imagining of pastoralism as heritage was only and could only be partial. And the result of this was the obscuring of many aspects of actually existing pastoralism. So I'm presenting a ambivalent, contradictory story, which in a sense, heritage is mobilized to defend pastoralism, but it can only do so to a certain extent, and many things get left out. And I show how these newer ideas of heritage and of pastoralism as heritage were in tension with longer established, older ideas of culture, of identity, and of the idea of nationality, which I'll say more about later. So I think there's a complex politics to the conceptualization of pastoralism as heritage, which we need to unpack in this case. And I think this tells us interesting things about minority relations with the Chinese state. Okay, let's see if I can manage to change this. Yeah. Okay. Oh no, actually, I'm jumping ahead. Since the start of the 21st century, and across... Okay, thanks. No, it's fine. It's fine, thank you. Yeah, thanks. Since the start of the 21st century, across China's western regions, many largely ethnic minority herders have had their lives and livelihoods upended in the interests of conservation, grassland conservation, since their livestock have been blamed for causing desertification and the sandstorms that plague northern China, and particularly its capital, Beijing, in the spring. And as part of this targeting of pastoralists, because of their supposedly environmentally destructive livelihoods, pastoralists have been subjected to a range of measures, from grassland enclosure and fencing. So you can see there's a picture from my field site in Alsha on the left, stocking limits, so limits on the number of animals that herders can keep, total grazing bans, and even resettlement away from the grasslands. This resettlement away from the grasslands in particular has gained a lot of attention from critical scholars, often working in the West. But these environmental policies go far beyond simply resettlement, and they also apply to herders who are still herding animals on the grasslands. So, within China studies and within environmental studies, there have been debates recently about China's particular brand of environmentalism, a particular brand of state-led, top-down environmentalism, which is hailed by some as the kind of potential savior of humanity through its kind of vigor and forcefulness, but which others see as kind of inherently problematic and coercive. And indeed, recent scholars have talked of a coercive environmentalism, and they've argued that these environmental measures on the part of the Chinese state, particularly in Western regions, these grassland management, anti-desertification measures, while on the surface being pertaining to a kind of environmental logic about grassland conservation, in fact also have as a goal the assimilation of minorities and an attempt to kind of bind minorities more closely into the Chinese nation. And so these arguments have gained a lot of traction, and in some senses, to a degree, are persuasive. But I think many of the people that promulgate these have not really worked in minority areas, and these theories, in fact, leave little room for minority agency. Instead, the minorities are simply moved and shunted around and subjected to measures by the Chinese state. And I think we have to be careful, obviously, when we talk about agency and not to overemphasize these things, but I think we do need to also attend to attempts of minorities to change narratives, change policies, however circumscribed these have been. And it should be noted that, of course, my fieldwork is based on a period starting in the early 2010s, which to some extent no longer exists because of changes in the trajectory of Chinese governance. But I think some of it, hopefully, a lot of it still does hold true. So my argument, in a sense, is that minorities have pushed back against this stigmatization of minority lifeways, particularly mobile pastoralism. And they've done so particularly using the more politically safe language of heritage. Sorry. Right. So the 21st century witnessed the emergence of what scholars have referred to as cultural heritage fever in China. And I think on the one hand, this was due to this fever emerged from anxieties about the rapid pace of development in the country and concerns over cultural vanishing. But I think from the state's point of view, also this cultural heritage fever was seen as a way for China to regain its natural or its rightful place in the world order through fora such as UNESCO. And I think this cultural heritage fever, this context of interest in all sorts of forms of cultural heritage, provided local Mongol elites working in cultural domains in Alshao with the language and the institutional support to celebrate certain elements of pastoralism. in the face of the state's environmental policies targeting pastoralists. So, in a sense, my book is describing a rather contradictory situation that I observed in the early 2010s, when on the one hand, environmental policies seem to be aimed at dismantling pastoralism, while at the same time, certain aspects of it were being celebrated by the state as well as heritage. So in 2008, these local Mongol elites succeeded in having Alshaz's camel husbandry practices listed as part of China's national intangible cultural heritage. This comprised of 3 elements: camel racing, the craft of camel tack, so the equipment which you use to ride camels, and also camel veneration rituals. Now, unfortunately, I don't think I have time to go into these in detail now. You'll have to read the book to find out more, but I can perhaps talk about them in the questions. But anyway, it's important to note the way in which heritage involved the itemizing of particular elements as heritage. So, why did this reframing of camel husbandry as heritage in the context of the state's environmental policies matter? What was significant about it? Well, I think partly as a result of this new heritage value of camel husbandry, this animal was exempted from some of the limits on grazing that were applied to other animals. So you were only allowed to herd a set number of goats and sheep, but these limits would be waived or would be much less strict in the case of camels. And camel numbers indeed began to increase. It's very contested.
Can you be more vague?
Could I be more vague? Well, it's a reflection of the difficulty of answering, I think. And also, I have to say, I'm also ill-qualified to judge the ecological effects of it. But my reading of it is that, yeah, it's mixed at best. I think in terms of tree planting, which is one of the kind of technologies that's used, often at the expense of herders because they have to move away for the trees to be planted. There have been improvements because there have been lessons learned about the kind of trees you can plant in certain areas, but at the same time, these kind of mass monocultural plantations that use up a lot of water themselves in these dryland areas have also been shown, in certain instances, not to be successful. So I don't want to use this platform to talk too much about things that I'm not and don't know that much about, but I think my reading of the literature is that it's mixed. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
My question is so simple. Is there any distinction between the nomadism and pastoralism? Do they treat it as a cultural heritage, or
do they treat both nomadism as a cultural heritage? In the sense of my first sense of nomadic heritage, well, there'll be others in the room that will know at least as much as me about this, and probably more. But I think in the 2000s, China started talking about grassland civilization, which I think was a response, and Nassim has written about this, Nassim Baksh has written about this, which was the response to the very idea of nomadic civilization that we're talking about. And I think part of grassland civilization also fits with my argument, because what you see is movement from a movement to a particular place. Now, when you talk about a grassland civilization, you can talk about nomads. Grasslands encompass nomads, but they also encompass recent Chinese settlers, for example. So I think that's my understanding of how ideas of nomadic civilization got taken up in China and responded to in ways that were politically expedient in the context of Inner Mongolia.
So, any other questions?
I have a question myself, actually. So you mentioned, it had this very fascinating phrase that some aspects of actually existing pastoralism were obscured in the project to protect some pastoral practices, at least, under the title of heritage. And so I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that. Long, long ago, back in the 1980s when I was there, it was a different sort of, if you like, politics, or even a political economy, really, of local assertiveness. The processes by which local cadres made claims was a really key process, and it seems as if, even though in the age of market consumerist statism, or whatever we call China now, there's actually some analogous features. And back then, the distortions were, quite strange. They might mean, for example, because of the association of Mongol Minzu with pastoralism, agricultural Mongols had to sort of pretend that they were pastoralists who just happened to be growing some crops and things like this in order to receive full recognition and government subsidies and so on. So that was one sort of distortion or obscuring. And I was wondering about your case.
Yeah, that's right. That's really interesting analogy to the case of agricultural Mongols in Mongolia. I think what I mean is that the herding of sheep and goats in particular, which was by far and away what people relied on for cash, was not by and large celebrated as heritage. You didn't have any discussion of kind of a goat culture in the way that you had about camels, and goats were acknowledged perhaps as an economic necessity, but not as something that was distinctly outshine, something that should be celebrated as heritage.